Hey guys, in this video, we're going to talk about two phyla. The first phyla is Phylum Cnidaria, and that means stinging nettle. So there are over 11,000 different species in this phylum. And first thing we're going to talk about are their general characteristics. So Cnidarians have radial symmetry, which means they're able to interact with the environment equally in all directions. On top of that, they don't have a dorsal and a ventral side. Instead, they have an oral and an aboral side because they're not cephalized. They don't have a head. They are diploblastic. We have no organ systems in Phylum Cnidaria, so they're still pretty simple. They can move and they have tentacles. So when we look at Cnidarian classification, these are the organisms that we find in Cnidaria, but there are 5 classes that we're going to focus on. And these are the 5 that we're focusing on. There are 6 currently recognized, but as I've said, these are the 5 we're going to talk about. So when we think about the development of a Cnidarian, they are diploblastic. So they have 2 tissue layers. And the inner one is called the endoderm. We see this layer right here. That's going to form the gastrodermis, or the gut cavity lining. That gut cavity is called a gastrovascular cavity. Then we have this blue tissue layer that's all on the outside. That is the ectoderm. It's forming the epidermis. Then between those 2 tissue layers, we see this red region. All of that red is making up the mesoderm. It's called mesoglia, which is this non-living kind of jelly-like layer between the endoderm and the ectoderm. So there are 2 body forms. We have a medusa and a polyp for Cnidarians. The first one we'll talk about are polyps. This is known as the hydroid form. So polyps, they are vegetative. They reproduce asexually. They're also sessile, so they're immobile because they are attached to a substrate at this aboral end. Now, they can detach themselves, whether it's through somersaulting, some can walk on their tentacles, but for the most part, polyps are going to stay sessile. We recognize them as having this tubular body, and then their mouth is going to be pointed up, surrounded by tentacles. Then we have the medusa stage. So this is our jellyfish form. They reproduce sexually, and we'll look at that in a little bit when we look at life cycles. They can also move. This is the mobile form, but it's very limited movement. If a jellyfish wants to move or a medusa wants to move horizontally, they're going to utilize the water currents or the wind. And then if they want to do it vertically, they can kind of swim up or down. Then they have this umbrella-shaped body with that mouth opening pointed down. So without body systems, how do these jellyfish actually live? How do they survive and get the nutrients that they need? Well, they kind of break it down, or we're going to break it down into 4 or 5 main categories. First one is respiration. So the way that they get the oxygen that they need is the oxygen is going to diffuse into their body from the water. Then digestion, they use that gastrovascular cavity that we saw. They are going to have food enter through their mouth and go into that cavity. Now, how do they get rid of waste? How do they excrete things? That's going to be by individual cells through the process of diffusion. But then finally, circulation, how do they move all these nutrients and these gases through their bodies? They utilize that mesoglia, the mesoderm. The nutrients and gases are going to move through that mesoderm to other cells through diffusion. So all Cnidarians are carnivorous predators, and jellyfish are going to capture small animals that drift through the water with those tentacles that contain stinging cells. We'll look at those on the next slide, but even things like these sessile corals, polyps, or sea anemones, they're predatory too. So they use those tentacles to sting and then bring prey into their mouths. Once that prey has moved through the mouth opening, then digestion is going to happen in this gastrovascular cavity. So broken down food and nutrients, it's then going to be absorbed by the cells that are made up or making up this gastrodermis, that inner cell layer. Now, the way that they digest their food is from enzymes that are excreted by these cells called gland cells. So gland cells are located on that inner layer, the endoderm, and they discharge the enzymes that digest food extracellularly or outside of the cells. Now, Cnidarians have very specialized cells called cnidocytes, which are our stinging cells, and then they contain organelles called nematocysts, which have the actual stingers in them. So these cells are cnidocytes. They're present around the mouth and tentacles, and they serve to immobilize prey with toxins contained within the cells. So a nematocyst, this inner kind of bulb within that cnidocyte, so we see it right here, that orange part. Then nematocysts contain these coiled threads, and that thread sometimes can have barbs like the two that we see right here. So the outer wall of our cell, the cnidocyte, so this entire cell right here, we see that little part that is sticking out. That's called the trigger. That is a hair-like projection called a cnidocyll that is very, very sensitive. So when it's touched or if a tentacle rubs up against your arm, that cell is going to fire the coiled thread inside the nematocyst that's either going to penetrate the flesh of that prey, that predator, or ensnare it. So those threads will then release a toxin into that target that's going to either immobilize the prey or scare away a predator. Now, a jellyfish's nervous system is extremely primitive. It's actually not even a system. It's just a collection of nerve cells scattered all around their body, known as a nerve ring and a nerve net. The nerve cells are going to help them respond to stimuli, coordinate movement like moving the tentacles, moving food to their mouth, digesting food, or expelling waste. The general life cycle of cnidarians, those can be seen to the right, and it's called alternation of generations because one generation is the medusa body form that produces polyps, and then the polyps produce medusa. So all medusa, like we see right here, all medusa are going to produce gametes, and they are dioecious. So that means that they are separate male and female sexes. Once a sperm fertilizes an egg, that zygote is going to form and it develops into a planula larva. That larva is then going to settle on some sort of substrate. It'll anchor itself and grow into a polyp. That polyp is then going to reproduce asexually, budding, fission, petal laceration to create more polyps. Eventually, a polyp is going to form something called a medusa bud, and that bud's going to break off in the form of an immature jellyfish. Then that jellyfish is going to mature and our cycle starts over again. Now we're moving on to the actual classes of our cnidarians. So I would pause the video right here and I would write down the 5 classes, what they mean, and then examples of each. First class we're going to talk about are Anthozoa. This is our largest class of cnidarians. There are over 6,000 different species. And they can come in, so there are corals and our sea anemones, and we see sea anemones right here. They are going to come in either colonial, so a lot together, or solitary. They lack a medusa stage, and they are only found in marine waters. And then we see in this animation right here, we have our polyp that is detaching itself because starfish are actually predators of sea anemones. So that sea anemone is trying to get away. Now, they also have symbiotic relationships with different animals. 2 are hermit crabs and clownfish. So for our hermit crabs, this guy right here, he looks a little weird because there are actually 2 sea anemones attached to its shell. So those anemones, they're going to get to move with the crab, and they also feed off of some of the same things that that crab is going to eat. Then we have our clownfish. And our clownfish, they, like in Finding Nemo, they live among the sea anemone tentacles. They are immune to that venom. And so they're provided protection. And then the sea anemone benefits because the clownfish is going to kick up that water and kind of get some movement in the water to help move nutrients to that anemone. One type of anthozoa are our stony corals. And those are the main kinds of coral that are responsible for building coral reefs. Typically, you'll see a lot of coral growing together, and then those polyps that make up the coral, they're able to retract into a calcium carbonate skeleton if they need protection. So you know a coral reef is alive and active if it's like this picture here, nice and full of color. And they actually have a relationship with photosynthetic zooxanthellae, which are a type of algae. It's a symbiotic relationship because the coral is going to be provided food, and the algae helps deposit calcium carbonate. And then that coral in turn is going to provide safety and compounds that the algae needs for photosynthesis. Now, if coral becomes stressed due to something like increased water temperature, they're actually going to expel that algae, and that's going to result in this right here, which is called coral bleaching. If a coral cannot regain that algae, then it's going to permanently die. All right, next are our class Hydrozoa. And things like this guy right here, the Portuguese man-o-war, they are oftentimes confused as being a jellyfish, but they're actually not. They are a hydroid colony. So they are made up of hundreds or even thousands of individual little hydropolyps that form this whole colony. And then there are going to be specialized regions if they do form colonies like this. There will be some sort of region for feeding, a region for budding, some sort of defense so that they can function together. Then we also have something like this green hydra. Those are found in freshwater and they're pretty small, but most of our hydrozoa are marine. Now, fire corals, if you've ever been snorkeling and rubbed across a fire coral, it feels exactly like it sounds like. If you touch a fire coral, it feels like your skin is on fire. And they resemble true corals, so they look like a piece of coral. They are actually massive colonies of polyps. Our next class are class Scyphozoa. These are our true jellies because the medusa stage is the dominant stage and that polyp stage is usually absent or super reduced. Now, usually class Scyphozoa are either pink or orange, but sometimes they can look like this, which is a moon jellyfish. Now, Scyphozoa, they're found all around the world in anything from Arctic to tropical waters, but most are found in those coastal waters close to the beach. Jellyfish love the beach just as much as humans do, so you got to watch out for them. Now, class Cubozoa, they are exactly as they sound. They are cube-shaped animals, and they are known as box jellyfish. So they have a square shape if you were to view them from above. And then one species of box jellyfish in Australia, it's actually one of the most deadly creatures in the world. Even with all of the scientific advancements that we have, the world still doesn't know how the toxins of that box jellyfish, the venom causes cardiac arrest, but we don't know why. And a really cool thing about these jellyfish is they actually have eyes that are more complex than you would think. They will physically hunt and go after their prey. They can actually move up to 4.6 miles per hour, which for a jellyfish is pretty fast. It's not really clear how the box jellyfish use those images that are created by their lenses in their eyes because they don't have brains. So we're not sure how they use those pictures. And then if we think about where their tentacles are, if you look at each corner of the square on their body, that is where the tentacles come off from. All right, class Staurozoa, this is the last class we're going to talk about, and it's a very small class. And these are known as our stalked jellyfish. Most of them do not like tropical water. They prefer waters in polar and boreal waters in the northern hemisphere. So they're going to be found, and they're really, really small. They're going to be found attached to things like rocks and seaweed from probably around like Northern California and up in those cooler waters. They have this goblet or a trumpet shape, and then they have 8 tentacles that are going to surround their mouth. They do lack a medusa stage. And then an interesting fact, even though they have that polyp shape, they internally function more like medusa than they do like polyps. All right, now our second phyla we'll talk about are ctenophores, and these are our comb jellies. And I actually spelled the phylum wrong, so it's actually supposed to be Ctenophora. So when you write it down, make sure that you swap that N and the E around. Some general characteristics are that ctenophores are biradially symmetric. So you can actually divide them into 2 planes. You can divide them this way and this way. Now they don't have any stinging cells. They have no nematocysts. They actually have something called a coloblast, which is an adhesive cell. So that helps them. They typically have 2 tentacles that are retractable, and those tentacles have coloblasts on them. They're like sticky cells that attach to their prey, and then they can bring them up to their mouth that's typically facing upwards when they're swimming. And then they're also bioluminescent, like we can see in this picture here, and like we saw in the previous slide. So if you ever go to the beach and you see the water glowing, it could be a ctenophore, or it could be something else. If you ever go swimming, I know like when we go to the beach, we always find what we think are jellyfish, but you can pick them up and they don't have any tentacles. It's probably a ctenophore. Now, last thing, jellyfish, they do have a natural predator, which is the sea turtle. And sea turtles, they love to eat jellyfish as a snack because they're pretty immune to the stinging. But a bad thing is that humans and our environmental impact on the oceans, there's a lot of pollution in the oceans. And unfortunately, things like plastic bags, like we see right here, a plastic bag looks a whole lot like a jellyfish, and turtles can't tell them apart. So oftentimes a turtle is going to go after a plastic bag that it thinks is a jellyfish. It'll ingest it. And unfortunately, that can lead to death. And the turtle didn't know that wasn't a jellyfish. All right, so that is the end of our notes, and I will see you next time.